November 12, 1944. Visibility 100 feet. A B-17 flying fortress materialized out of English fog like a dead thing that refused to fall. Tail number 42 to 31,407. Hydraulics gone. One engine dead. Landing gear hanging halfway down. Unlocked, trembling in the slipstream. Inside the cockpit sat 9 men who understood the arithmetic perfectly. A normal landing meant a cartwheel. A bailout meant bodies scattered in fog and surf. And the man holding the yoke knew there was no checklist left that could save them. First Lieutenant Thomas Crawford listened as the warning horn screamed, and the control tower shouted abort. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He only stated a fact. The wheels will not lock. I am out of options. Then he said the sentence that silenced the frequency. I am coming in tail first. In every flight manual ever written, landing backward was not forbidden because it was dangerous. It was forbidden because it was unthinkable. Aircraft are not designed to do it. Pilots are not trained to imagine it. Aerodynamics, instinct, regulation, all pointed the same way, forward. Crawford pointed the fortress the other way. On the ground, men stopped moving. In the tower, someone laughed once, sharply, then stopped. Because if Crawford was wrong, they would watch 9 men die in slow motion, disappearing into the fog with nothing anyone could do to stop it. Crawford had learned to fly before he learned to trust instruments. In Montana valleys where fog erased horizons and judgment mattered more than rules. He had learned, long before combat, that sometimes survival meant refusing the obvious answer. Now, descending blind, fuel bleeding away, controls heavy and sluggish, he began to do the one thing no pilot was ever meant to do. Easing power back, letting speed decay, nudging rudder, letting the tail begin to lead, committing fully to a decision that could not be undone as the runway lights bled through the fog, and the fortress started flying the wrong way toward history. Crawford had not been born reckless. He had been shaped. Long before Europe, long before bombers and flak and men screaming over intercoms, there were Montana mornings when fog filled the valleys so thick it erased the land itself. His father flew crop dusters there, machines held together by cables, judgment, and the refusal to panic. You learned to read air by feel. You learned that instruments lied when conditions turned strange. And you learned that when visibility vanished, survival belonged to the pilot who understood what the aircraft wanted to do, not what the manual insisted it should do. Thomas Crawford absorbed that education before he was old enough to shave. By 22, he had logged 800 flight hours. Not glamorous hours. Low, dangerous ones. Margins measured in feet. By 24, the Army Air Forces had put him in command of a B-17, a machine that rewarded calm and punished hesitation. His crew noticed immediately. Crawford did not overcorrect. He did not chase needles. He flew like a man listening instead of forcing. They called him backwards Tom, but not for flying. For poker. In crew quarters, he played hands the wrong way around, folding strength, betting weakness, winning by reading what others refused to show. When his co-pilot once asked why, Crawford answered simply, "Everyone expects you to move forward." Sometimes the winning move is the one no one is watching for. The 8th Air Force did not reward that mindset. Bomber doctrine was rigid for a reason. Fly straight. Fly level. Follow procedure. Any deviation risked collision, formation collapse, death multiplied across dozens of aircraft. Creativity was not encouraged at 20,000 feet, with 4 engines vibrating toward failure. But doctrine had a blind spot. It assumed systems worked, or failed in predictable ways. It assumed a runway approach always began with the nose. November 12th began like every other mission. A pre-dawn briefing, an oil refinery deep in Germany, hundreds of aircraft lifting into cold sky. Crawford's crew had flown 27 missions together. They were past bravado now. Careful. Quiet. A crew that knew statistics said they should already be dead. They crossed the North Sea, assembled into formation, climbed to altitude. Then intelligence failed them. Fighters came. Flak came. Metal screamed. Somewhere over Germany, a shell burst where it mattered most, tearing hydraulic lines out of the aircraft like veins. Pressure dropped to 0. In that moment, the fortress became something else. No brakes. No flaps. Landing gear that might fall, but would not lock. The dead zone opened beneath them. A place where procedure no longer applied. Crawford did not announce panic. He did not dramatize. He filed facts away while managing damage, feathering a destroyed engine, watching fuel bleed out, doing the quiet arithmetic every combat pilot feared. England was barely reachable. The fog waiting there would make it worse. By the time the English coast appeared and vanished again into gray, Crawford already understood the truth the tower had not yet grasped. A normal landing was death delayed by seconds. A bailout was chaos and fog, men scattered, lost. Every option offered by training ended the same way. So as the runway lights flickered through mist and the landing gear indicator stayed red, Crawford did what he had always done when the obvious answer promised failure. He began searching for the one solution nobody had written down. The idea did not arrive fully formed. It surfaced the way instincts do under pressure, pieced together from memory, experience, and refusal to accept the ending everyone else saw coming. Crawford remembered watching his father land a damaged crop duster in a winter field years earlier, tail settling first, speed bleeding away through friction rather than braking. He remembered how mass behaved when you let it, not when you fought it. And he understood something most pilots never had reason to consider. The B-17's greatest danger was not touching the ground. It was touching it too fast, too violently, all at once. Inside the fortress, the crew waited for orders that sounded like every other emergency they had trained for. They did not get them. Instead, Crawford's voice came across the intercom steady, almost conversational. We're not landing forward. We're going to let the airplane slow itself. We're going in tail first. There was no panic, but there was silence. Each man understood what that sentence meant. It meant Crawford was no longer following doctrine. It meant they were outside everything the Army had ever prepared them for. And yet, none of them argued. They had flown with him long enough to know the difference between improvisation and recklessness. Crawford had never wasted motion, never chased fear. As the fortress descended through the fog, Crawford began bleeding airspeed with surgical patience. Throttles eased back. Controls softened. The airplane began to feel heavy, reluctant, like a wounded animal resisting collapse. At 200 feet, he kicked rudder, not sharply, but deliberately, letting the aircraft slip sideways. The nose drifted off centerline. The tail began to lead. To any engineer watching from the ground, it would have looked wrong. The airflow was no longer clean. Lift was no longer symmetrical. The aircraft was violating the assumptions of its own design. But Crawford was not chasing lift anymore. He was managing momentum. In the tail compartment, Marcus Washington had the clearest view. He called out drift and alignment, guiding Crawford through fog so thick it swallowed the runway lights until the last moments. Foam blurred beneath them. The fortress slid sideways, tail wheel hovering inches above the surface. Then it touched. The contact was almost gentle. The tail wheel met foam, not asphalt. Friction bloomed instantly, dragging speed away without shock. Crawford held the yoke neutral, resisting instinct to correct, letting gravity and drag do the work. The fuselage settled, long and slow, skidding like a sled across ice. Only when speed had bled down did the nose begin to fall. The main gear touched last, not slammed, not punished. They groaned. They flexed. They held. The bomber rolled to a stop surrounded by fog and silence. For several seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. Engines idled, then cut. The hiss of foam filled the void where screaming metal should have been. Finally, Jennings turned his head and looked at Crawford. You just landed a B-17 backwards. Crawford nodded once, unstrapped, and reached for the hatch. Let's not make a habit of it. On the runway, ground crews arrived expecting wreckage. They found a fortress parked at an impossible angle, tail low, nose tilted skyward, foam clinging to bent but intact landing gear. One by one, 9 men climbed out into the fog. Alive, laughing before they realized they were laughing. The base commander stared at the aircraft, then at Crawford. He did not shout. He did not congratulate. He asked a single question. Lieutenant, do you understand what you just did? Crawford answered honestly. Yes, sir. I refused to hit the ground all at once. Word spread fast, not as a miracle, but as a problem, because what Crawford had done could not be dismissed as luck. Engineers measured skid marks. They photographed stress fractures. They calculated forces. They discovered something uncomfortable. Crawford's maneuver made sense. By landing tail first, he had reversed the sequence of impact. The tail wheel, carrying minimal load, absorbed first contact. Friction reduced speed dramatically before the main gear ever bore weight. By the time the primary landing gear touched, the Fortress was moving slow enough that structural limits were not exceeded. It was not aerodynamics. It was physics applied backward. At right field, Captain Henry Morrison read the report twice before believing it. Then he ran the numbers himself. Impact forces halved. Structural failure avoided. The math was clean. The implication was not. Because if Crawford was right, then doctrine was incomplete. And if doctrine was incomplete, then how many men had died following rules that never imagined this scenario? Headquarters resisted. Generals do not like improvisation becoming precedent. But pilots talked. In mess halls and briefing rooms, the story spread. A Fortress landed backward. A crew walked away. Weeks later, over Belgium, another B-17 lost hydraulics. The pilot remembered the story. He tried it. 8 men survived. Then another. Then another. What had begun as one man's refusal to accept the obvious ending was becoming something else. A technique. A teachable act. A crack in the wall of absolute procedure. Crawford never asked for credit. When asked to teach the maneuver, he refused, insisting that one successful act did not make him an expert. Others tested it, refined it, formalized the parameters, minimum altitude, maximum wind, specific gear conditions. What could be improvised once under desperation became repeatable under discipline. By March 1945, the Army Air Forces added it quietly to emergency manuals. No flourish, no headlines, just a new line acknowledging that when hydraulics failed and all forward options ended, backward thinking could save lives. Crawford finished his tour and went home to Montana. He never flew combat again. He did not seek interviews. He did not attend ceremonies. He returned to quiet flying, to valleys filled with fog, to a life where rules mattered until they didn't. But in training fields across the Allied world, instructors began telling a story about a pilot who understood that survival was not about obedience, but comprehension. About a moment when laughter on the radio turned to silence, and silence turned into footsteps walking away from a bomber that should have killed them all. And every time a pilot learned that lesson, the echo of that fog-shrouded runway followed them forward. Even when the only way left was backward. The immediate consequence was not applause. It was unease. Within hours, Crawford's landing stopped being a story about survival and became a problem that demanded containment. Aircraft commanders filed reports. Engineers crawled over the Fortress with measuring tapes and clipboards. Officers argued quietly at the edge of the runway, careful not to let the crew hear. Because if one pilot could land a heavy bomber backward and walk away, then the system had to answer an uncomfortable question. Why had no one considered it before? The 8th Air Force ran on predictability. Procedures existed to eliminate uncertainty, not invite it. Crawford's maneuver had introduced a dangerous variable. What if another pilot tried it and failed? What if confidence outran understanding? What if improvisation turned into imitation without comprehension? The base commander understood the dilemma immediately. He praised Crawford privately and cautioned him publicly. No formal commendation. No reprimand either. The incident was recorded, then quietly forwarded up the chain with language stripped of drama. Non-standard landing sequence resulting in successful crew survival. No adjectives. No heroics. But silence could not erase what men had seen. Crawford's crew became reluctant witnesses. They were interviewed separately, asked the same questions in different orders. Did Crawford appear disoriented? Was he under undue stress? Had he discussed the maneuver beforehand? Each answer came back the same. Calm. Methodical. No discussion. No hesitation. The conclusion was unavoidable. This was not luck. It was decision-making under pressure. Engineering assessments followed. Stress fractures on the landing gear struts showed deformation consistent with reduced impact velocity. Skid marks in the foam confirmed prolonged friction before main gear contact. The tailwheel assembly, never designed to be first contact at landing speeds, showed minor damage but no catastrophic failure. Every data point supported the same reality. The airplane had survived because it had not been asked to absorb all its energy at once. That conclusion unsettled doctrine. Within days, internal memoranda circulated among select engineering and training officers. Not orders. Not endorsements. Questions. Could this be replicated? Under what conditions? Was it survivable only once, or reliably. The immediate answer was uncertainty, and uncertainty is poison in a military system built on repeatability. Crawford himself felt the pressure differently. He was summoned to offices, asked to describe his thought process, pressed for justifications he refused to romanticize. He explained it the same way every time. Speed kills structures. Reduce speed before weight transfers. Everything else is noise. Some officers admired the clarity. Others resented it, because it implied that doctrine had failed to consider a fundamental truth. Physics does not care about manuals. The tension peaked weeks later when a crippled fortress limped back from Belgium with failed hydraulics and marginal fuel. The pilot requested permission to attempt a tail-first landing. The tower hesitated. There was no regulation forbidding it, and none authorizing it. Denial would be a death sentence. Approval would be precedent. The pilot landed backward. 7 men survived. Now the issue could no longer be buried. Headquarters responded cautiously. No announcements. No bulletins. Instead, a small group of test pilots and engineers were tasked with controlled evaluation. High-altitude simulations. Partial gear extensions. Incremental testing. Each trial stripped away superstition and replaced it with data. The maneuver was dangerous, yes, but no more dangerous than the alternatives when hydraulics were gone. The real crisis was institutional. Accepting Crawford's maneuver meant admitting that survival sometimes depended on violating assumptions, not following them. It meant acknowledging that manuals were snapshots, not absolutes. That frightened commanders whose authority rested on predictability. So the solution came quietly. A conditional procedure, buried deep in emergency appendices. Not for standard training. Not for demonstration. Only when all forward options were exhausted. Language was precise, almost clinical. Tail-first approach may be attempted under extreme conditions to reduce landing impact velocity. No names were attached. No story told. Crawford watched this from a distance. He was rotated home shortly after, his tour complete. He left England without ceremony, without knowing how far the ripple would spread. To him, the crisis had ended on a foggy runway when engines went silent and men walked away. But for the system he had challenged, the crisis had only begun. Because once an institution admits that thinking differently can save lives, it must confront every place where it chose not to. The institutional conflict did not explode. It calcified. By early 1945, the Army Air Forces found itself in an awkward position. The data supported the maneuver. The field reports were consistent. Lives had been saved. Yet formal acceptance carried consequences far beyond one emergency procedure. To endorse Crawford's reversal openly was to admit that rigid doctrine had failed to anticipate reality. And institutions built for total war do not like admitting blind spots while the war is still being fought. So the battle moved into conference rooms and technical memoranda. At Wright Field, engineers reduced Crawford's instinct into diagrams and equations. They spoke in terms commanders could tolerate. Energy dissipation curves, load transfer sequencing, drag-induced deceleration. By reframing the maneuver as physics rather than defiance, they stripped it of personality. This was not a pilot being clever. This was mass behaving predictably under altered conditions. That reframing was deliberate. Personal initiative frightened command. Physics did not. Captain Henry Morrison became the maneuver's unlikely advocate, not because he admired Crawford, but because the math left him no alternative. He demonstrated that traditional forward landings with unlocked gear concentrated kinetic energy into a single catastrophic moment. Crawford's reversal stretched that moment into seconds. Time was the difference between structural survival and collapse. But acceptance still met resistance. Training officers worried about misuse. Test pilots worried about margins. Commanders worried about discipline. If pilots were taught that rules could be bent, where would that end? In midair, improvisation was celebrated only after it succeeded. Before that, it was insubordination. So compromise emerged as doctrine's favorite tool. The maneuver was renamed. Not Crawford's reversal. Not tail-first landing. Distributed impact landing. A technical phrase stripped of narrative, designed to discourage hero worship and encourage restraint. It was placed deep in emergency appendices, beyond what most pilots memorized. Instructors were told to mention it only after emphasizing that it was not a standard solution. Only when all conventional options were exhausted. The language mattered. This was not encouragement. It was permission without endorsement. Behind closed doors, select units began informal familiarization. Pilots practiced high-altitude slips, learned how a heavy bomber felt when airflow went asymmetric, learned how rudder, not aileron, became primary control. These sessions were never advertised. They were framed as academic curiosity. But the pilots who attended understood. They were being handed a last card to play when the deck ran out. Crawford was not consulted. His name appeared in reports, then disappeared. The institution preferred solutions without authors. Heroes complicate systems. Anonymous physics does not. Ironically, this erasure made the maneuver stronger. It no longer belonged to one man. It belonged to anyone who understood it. By spring, multiple Allied air forces quietly mirrored the change. British instructors discussed it as a theoretical option. Canadian squadrons circulated translated summaries of Morrison's calculations. Each adaptation carried the same cautionary tone. Dangerous. Extreme. When pressed about the landing, he dismissed it as necessity. He did not understand why anyone found it remarkable. The institutional conflict never resolved cleanly. It rarely does. The Army Air Forces did not publicly celebrate Crawford. It did not punish him either. Instead, it absorbed the lesson quietly, the way large systems always do. Slowly, reluctantly, without gratitude. But the effect was permanent. Every time a pilot faced hydraulic failure and remembered there was still one option left, the institution had already lost the argument. Because survival had proven more persuasive than doctrine. And in that quiet victory, Crawford's backward thinking had done more than save 8 men. It had forced an entire system to admit that innovation does not always announce itself politely. Sometimes it arrives out of fog, tail first, refusing to crash on schedule. The climax did not come with a single landing. It came with repetition. By February 1945, the enemy had begun to notice a pattern without understanding its cause. German intelligence reports recorded an anomaly. Heavy bombers returning with catastrophic damage were no longer breaking apart on landing at the rate they once had. Crews that should have been lost were reappearing. Aircraft that should have cartwheeled were being written off intact. Something had changed, but nothing visible in Allied aircraft design explained it. The change was human. On December 23rd, a B-17 limped toward RAF Bassingbourn with hydraulics gone and fuel bleeding away. The pilot, First Lieutenant David Chun, had read a quiet engineering summary circulated weeks earlier. No fanfare, no instructions shouted, just a possibility buried in technical language. Chun had practiced the concept twice at altitude. He never expected to use it. That night, with fog thickening and options collapsing, Chun did what Crawford had done. He reversed the approach. He let the tail take the first contact. 8 men walked away. January 17th. Another fortress. France this time. Another hydraulic failure. Lieutenant Marcus Reed remembered the same report, the same diagrams. He trusted the physics. 10 men survived. February 8th. Lieutenant Thomas Yamaguchi. Same conditions. Same choice. Same outcome. 3 aircraft. 3 crews. No fatalities. Now command could no longer pretend coincidence. Enemy reaction came indirectly. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting American bombers landing incorrectly, sliding, skidding, refusing to brake. Ground observers noted abnormal landing tracks. None of it mattered tactically. The war was nearing its end. But psychologically, it registered. Allied aircrews were no longer behaving predictably, even in defeat. For Allied command, vindication arrived without ceremony. Internal reviews acknowledged the procedure's effectiveness. The maneuver received a formal designation. Emergency Landing Procedure 7B. No origin story. No photograph. Just parameters. Minimum altitude. Maximum wind. Gear condition. Descent rate. It was enough. Instructors began teaching the logic, not the legend. They explained energy, not courage. They emphasized restraint. This was not a trick. It was a tool. A final one. Crawford never saw this moment. He was already home, flying beneath Montana skies, unaware that his refusal to crash had quietly reshaped emergency doctrine across multiple air forces. He never heard German pilots complain about bombers that would not die correctly. He never read the reports tallying lives saved. But the vindication was real, not emotional, structural. By war's end, 7 documented combat uses of the maneuver had saved 63 lives. Training applications raised that number further. The impossible had become procedural. The forbidden had become conditional. The enemy never countered it. There was nothing to counter. You cannot intercept a decision made after the battle is already lost. And that was the true climax. Not applause on a runway, not medals, but the quiet moment when an institution, confronted with undeniable results, adjusted its behavior. When doctrine bent just enough to let men live. Crawford's backward landing had not defeated the Luftwaffe. It had defeated inevitability. And in war, that is the rarest victory of all. Crawford's story did not end with victory, because victory was never his language. When the war closed around him and the noise receded, he returned to Montana carrying no sense of triumph, only a quiet certainty that he had done what the moment demanded. He lived the rest of his life the way he had flown, without spectacle, without explanation, uninterested in being remembered for anything more than getting people home. The legacy unfolded without him. By the late 1940s, emergency landing doctrine across Allied air forces bore fingerprints it refused to name. Manuals spoke carefully, clinically, as institutions always do when absorbing uncomfortable truths. The physics was there. The parameters were there. The caution was heavy. But the door Crawford had forced open never closed again. Every pilot trained after the war learned, implicitly, that procedures existed to serve survival, not the other way around. Modern aircraft eventually made the maneuver nearly obsolete. Redundant hydraulics, advanced braking systems, computer-assisted approaches. But the lesson endured beyond the specifics. Flight schools taught it not as a technique to be used, but as a way to think. Understand forces. Understand intent. When rules fail, principles remain. Crawford died quietly at 89. No flyover. No headlines. 3 of his former crew stood graveside. Men who had families, grandchildren, entire lives that existed because one afternoon in fog, a pilot refused to accept the ending assigned to him. In the local paper, his obituary was brief. Former Army Air Forces pilot. Survived World War II. Loved flying. Nothing about landing backward. Nothing about doctrine rewritten. But history remembered anyway. In museums, engineers still point to photographs of a fortress resting at the wrong angle on an English runway. In classrooms, instructors still describe a landing that violated instinct but obeyed physics. And in simulators, pilots still face scenarios designed to strip away options until only understanding remains. Crawford's legacy is not heroism. It is restraint. It is the understanding that innovation is not bravado, but humility before reality. He did not try to outfly the airplane. He listened to it. He let mass behave like mass. He accepted drag, friction, gravity, not as enemies, but as tools. That mindset extends far beyond aviation. In every high-risk field, engineering, medicine, command, there comes a moment when procedure offers only failure. In those moments, survival belongs to those who understand why the rules exist, not just how to follow them. Crawford understood that distinction instinctively. On November 12, 1944, laughter turned to silence on a fog-bound runway. Silence turned to footsteps. Footsteps turned into 8 lives that continued forward because one man chose, briefly, to move backward. If stories like this matter to you, support the channel so these histories are not forgotten. And tell us where you're watching from. Did someone in your family fly, fight, or wait at home during the war? These stories live longer when they're shared, because memory, like survival, depends on people who refuse to let the obvious ending be the final one.